We've heard some really, really fascinating things today. I hope you've really enjoyed today. A few key takeaways already for me. Don't limit our horizons to the present. Ken told us at the top of the day. He also said to us, don't think just about what universities do, but think about what universities are for. And who could possibly forget what Lucy shared? Ask the girl to dance. It's all great, and we've heard some fascinating stuff, but how on earth are we going to pay for it all? So as we're drawing our conference to a close this year, we've got a bit of a high-stakes showdown for you. It's a critical debate. We've got a panel of experts who are going to dive both head and heart first into what is a really tricky conundrum: university funding. With one eye on the horizon, they'll dissect the economic and political future of tuition fees, seeking a balance between financial stability for universities and accessible education for all. So prepare for new ideas as the panel explores a wide spectrum of potential game changers, from international funding models to innovative student recruitment strategies, student loans, immigration dynamics, and the lifeblood of research funding. So this discussion is going to take us on a quest to answer the all-important question: do we play it safe, or do we take a bold leap when it comes to the future of UK university funding? So get ready for a thrilling ride. I'm going to ask the panel now to introduce themselves. Just run down the line.
He's looking at me. Can you hear me then? Good afternoon. My name is Elena Rodriguez Falcon. I'm the incoming Provost and Chief Academic Officer at Study Group. Formerly, I was one of the leading members of a team creating a new higher education institution in Hereford and Might. And we'll talk about that a bit more later, so I'll stop there.
Hello, thank you very much for staying. My name is Jenny Hyam. I'm Vice-Chancellor of St George's University of London. Prior to that, I was at Imperial for many years and did a big project in Singapore. And in addition to that role, I sit on the board of UUK and was elected to a position which requires optimism. That was to lead the conversation about the long-term sustainability of the funding for the university sector.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you too from me for staying, but I suspect they're staying for the drinks rather than for us. I'm not sure, because I believe there are drinks afterwards. I was just checking that on my phone. So my name's Nick Hillman. I'm director of HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute, and we're a Oxford-based higher education think tank supported by most universities in the UK. And we're very grateful for that support. And I'm also, when I'm not doing that, on the board of two universities, the University of Manchester, a very large research-intensive university, where I did my undergraduate studies, and also my local university, which is as different as it could be from Manchester, which is the University of Buckingham, a small university with doing mainly two-year degrees for mainly international students in Buckinghamshire. Thanks.
How do you do? My name is Peter Ainsworth. I have a small consultancy firm. Most of my career was in the city and financial services, but for a long time I've had an interest in the university funding problem. And I was commissioned by the Russell Group to write a paper on it in 2010, which the government reviewed at the time of when Nick was involved, when he put in place the scheme that we currently have. And since then I've been writing for the Institute of Economic Affairs and helping some universities with implementing loan schemes for their students.
Big thank you to our panel, and a particular thank you to Elena. I can't let this go unmentioned. So I got a message from Elena early this morning saying, "My train from Carmarthen has been cancelled. I'm going to drive." So yeah, that's enough.
I made it. Like the song said.
Absolutely. So the Academy is in peril. Take a look at the last published financial reports for the year ending July 2022. It paints a bleak picture. Only 37 mainstream universities are in surplus. Over 100 are in deficit, including all of the UK's institutions within the global top 200. A recent survey of Vice-Chancellors tells us that 90% of them think that the UK university sector has never faced greater threats or uncertainties, and they've cited financial vulnerability as a major contributing factor. John Raftery, a recent former Vice-Chancellor, wrote in a blog for HEPI published this week that it is indisputable that the funding system for English higher education is not only unfit for the future, it is also unfit for the present. Fees in England for domestic undergraduates have been frozen for 11 years now. £9,250 is only worth around 6k today in real terms. And during this period, the cost of running our institutions has increased by some 40% or thereabouts. So it's no surprise that universities claim that they run most undergraduate programmes at a loss. But if you look a little bit more closely at those financial statements and strip away the pension provisions that we've all got in there, the picture actually gets turned upside down. More than 100 of our public universities return surpluses, with only 20 or so in deficit. So what's actually going on? The sector has responded to financial challenges in two key ways that we're seeing across sums. Firstly, by managing costs, driving efficiency through better processes, through systems integration, and by taking a less siloed approach to our structural organisations. Indeed, improving operational efficiency is the core objective of more than half of the assignments that SUMS carries out. The second main response is through income diversification, growing international student income, transnational education, online provision and the like, introducing apprenticeships, so on and so forth. In many ways, improving operational efficiency while driving entrepreneurial approach to de-risk our business models sounds like exactly the sort of behaviour that the sector should be engaged in. But at the same time, it's hard to reconcile universities' reliance on economically sound tactics like these with the importance of knowledge, high skills, research to a high-growth economy. Universities are a public good, even if they're not of the public sector per se. And on that note, let's find out what our panelists think. I'm going to pose a tricky question and ask them really horribly to answer it in 2 minutes, just to kick us off. So, is the higher education funding model in the UK fundamentally broken? I'm going to go to Nick Hillman first for that.
Well, thanks again.
Sorry, you've only got 2 minutes. You can't use the next hour and 20.
Well, I'll answer it by saying no, then, and pass on to the next person. No, I honestly don't think the funding system is broken. Peter kindly referred to my previous job working as a special advisor in the coalition years and helping to implement the current system. And I stand by it because I think it worked well for universities, it meant well-funded universities, and it worked even better for something that matters even more than the institutions, which is the students, because it allowed us to remove student number caps. And I know that's sometimes been painful on the ground at individual institutions, but it has meant that everybody who is qualified and has the ability to go to university and has been offered a place can get in. And that simply wasn't the case when I started working at HE Policy 15 years ago. And it's very important that number caps stay off because of the rising number of 18-year-olds. So look, yes, there's a problem at the moment, and the problem stems from the fact that the system is not fundamentally broken. It stems from the fact that it hasn't kept up with inflation. If fees had kept up with inflation, then we wouldn't be having this conversation today. And just two other points, because I know we're tight for time. The first is, don't buy the false history. There's this view that for most of the post-war period, higher education in the UK was free. That is just wrong. The only period where higher education in the UK was free was from the late 1970s until 1990, when maintenance loans first came in. For most of British history, higher education has not been free, and the reintroduction of fees fees in 98, and then they're tripling in 2006, and then they're tripling again in 2012, is much more in line with the past than free higher education. So don't buy the false history. And the second thing I'd say is every single major political party, except the Scottish National Party and the Greens in Scotland, but every single other political party in power across the UK has accepted the logic of a co-payment system. And that was true even when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party promising free higher education. The Labour Party in power in Wales was implementing a system really quite similar to the one in England with high fees. So again, the closer people get to government, the more they realise that voters' priorities, I'm afraid, lie elsewhere: NHS, schools, defence, tax cuts. We're always at the bottom of the pile. So unless we have a co-payment system, which should reflect the rising costs of delivering higher education, unless we accept co-payment, we'll be living on even less money.
Thank you, Nick. Jenny, how about your take?
It's a no as well, but it's a difficult situation. So I sit as a Vice-Chancellor of a university that I needed to turn around, that does basically expensive subjects with no cross-subsidy. It's really the last 2 to 3 years have brought into sharp relief, despite that turnaround, inflation, failing infrastructure. On a day-to-day basis, we simply haven't got the capital reserves that we need to invest into things that I had 2 messages this morning, both of which were leaks in buildings that means that heating can't be turned on. That type of, we're not talking about swanky new buildings, we're talking about fundamentals. And the other thing that's happened is ever-increasing regulatory burden that's placed on a tiny team, and there's no sign of that relenting. We personally are looking to the future, and merger is one of the accommodations that we're considering. If I talk about the national work, fundamentally there are sort of 3 or 4 buckets that people can look to. The students and increasing the student loan book costs. The government for more subsidies, particularly perhaps around research, or perhaps asking business to contribute more. Bottom line is everybody wants somebody else to pay and not them. They think it's a good idea, but not them. And if I just look at international education, how many vice-chancellors are out this month in Hong Kong, China, everywhere else around the world, trying to get those students in? Because this year, many places suffered with people who said that they were going to come and they haven't, quite apart from the geopolitics of that. The other solution, transnational education initiatives. I've worked in America, I've worked in different places in Europe, and I did a big project in Singapore. Most of those are associated with a huge amount of work and a high likelihood of failure. And that's not just a UK problem, that also is the experience of many international colleagues. Research, we want to be a research powerhouse, and the government would say, well, actually, we've given you money for that. But for those of you that subscribe to Research Professional, you'll see this morning that the Russell Group have got together and said, we need 4 billion to actually deliver what you want. I mean, it's all right for the Russell Group to feather their own nest. There's lots of the rest of us that would like some extra money in that regard. Another thing that we've been considering is asking charities to pay more towards the costs of university, whether that's reasonable or not, but that's the reality, that we don't get anywhere near the overheads for much of the research that we do. And then finally, just a couple of comments around business. Business wants a skilled workforce and indeed benefits from many of the outputs from university, but probably don't want to pay any more towards it. Lots of people want to put dibs on that apprenticeship levy that doesn't appear to be doing very much for anybody. Nobody says, I love it. Well, perhaps a small percentage do. They were the 2 words. And then, so what does the government want? Well, I think basically wants the university sector to stop whining and shut up. We are basically very well endowed relative to FE and other parts of the economy, and they've got many other pressing issues to invest in, and I don't think we're coming anywhere near the top of that list. And they want, and we have to respect what is wanted, which universities, we need to drive economic growth. They need to create an environment where there's greater tax revenue for investment. And we also need to respond to the needs for increased skills and productivity. We would argue we're doing that, but we also need to get our messaging and try and actively help with those agendas as well.
Thank you, Jenny. Elena, is the system broken for you?
For me, it has been broken for a long time. But of course, I have a very different perspective, and I will start my introduction with that. I'm an engineer from Mexico. I was an international student. I worked for a Russell Group University, was part of creating a new institution from scratch. And I've seen that every single sort of aspect and institution I worked for needed to challenge assumptions about what higher education is for. I heard you say that someone asked that question. What are we here for? And I think that's such an important question. So to me, it is broken. It has been broken for a long, long time. And perhaps controversially, the reason I say that is because when you look as an international student first and then member of staff, that we have in the UK a reliance on cross-subsidizing high-quality thinking, which is at the core of higher education institutions in the UK, from home undergraduate and particularly international students' fees. Well, I think that's quite unfair, particularly on the country who finances student loans, on those students who pay high tuition fees compared to other countries, and then on the international students who not only come here at a great personal and financial cost, but then come here and perhaps receive not the support that they need, a substandard education on occasion, or compromise at the very least, and of late, an environment that is unwelcoming. So for me, it is, yes, it's broken, and for those reasons.
Thank you, Elena. And finally, Peter.
Thank you. Well, first of all, Elena, it's wonderful to have so many things in common. So we're the two yeses. The system is definitely broken. But also, I also came from Carmarthen yesterday, and my train was also cancelled. But I should emphasise, first of all, I'd be talking about undergraduate, home undergraduate funding. I don't think there's a problem with postgraduate funding. I don't think there's a particular problem with international student funding. Maybe they're not getting the education they hope for, but I don't think there's a funding problem. And I'm not talking about research. That's kind of a separate issue. So I'm focused on home undergraduate funding. And I think there the system, with all due respect to Nick, is most definitely broken and was badly designed from the outside. And one problem, obviously, we all know about is that universities aren't getting sufficient resources. They're having to cross-subsidise in order to survive, and longer term that may be, a bigger problem than it already is. But there are a number of other issues that the present funding system generates. So these statistics come from a number of papers. They're not all completely current, but they give you a flavour. So one is that 20% of graduates are estimated to be earning less than they would have earned had they not gone to university. 30% of graduates are estimated to be in non-graduate jobs they could have done without going to university 5 years after graduation. Despite the number of people going to university, there remain significant skills shortages. I think it's grossly unfair that we charge the same to go and study at Oxbridge. I was very fortunate. I was one of the 1970 to 1990 cohort, so I was incredibly fortunate. I didn't pay. In fact, I got a grant, so that was unfair then. For other people, I benefited, but now the idea that an Oxbridge education should charge $9,250 and a low tariff university should also be charging the same, there's something wrong there. I'm concerned about the second class status for those who do not attend university. I think that's a bigger problem that again flows from the the funding system, in the money that's dedicated to that class of people and not to the people who don't go to university. And then finally, because the money comes from the state, we've ended up with excessive regulation, which I think is particularly a problem at the moment. We've all been talking a lot about artificial intelligence. That's going to require not just funding in order to address that challenge, but also some more freedoms, which regulation is very hard. So all of those different problems all flow not from the co-payment, which I support, but from the fact that it's the government that pays the money to the university, and the student then has a contract with the government. That's the bit that I think is wrong. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. So I hope you've seen here that we've got 4 people on the panel who are shy, retiring types. They're going to need a little bit of coaxing to say what they really think. In order to do the coaxing, I've got a few pre-prepared questions, but I do want you to be thinking of the questions that you want to ask of the panel. We've heard some big themes already. We've heard some issues around the burden of regulation. The challenge, the problem, if you like, around cross-subsidisation. Is it morally right? Is it right for the individual that ends up paying over the odds almost to study at the same institution as someone from the UK for whom the government is effectively carrying a loan at a much lower level? We've also heard the challenges there from Peter around access, fair access. We talk about access a great deal as a sector and how wonderful that is. Is it really, given the stats that Peter's just quoted, as wonderful as we collectively make out? Big questions out there, so get your thinking caps on. And in the meantime, I'm going to return to Nick for a point that you've already made to an extent. We've got a general election looming. There's not a huge amount anymore between the 2 main parties on undergraduate tuition fees in the UK. In England, very specifically. And I think that if there is going to be much airtime spent on that in the run-up to the election, it's all going to be focused. The HE debate will focus on domestic undergraduate fees in England. That's a pretty narrow lens. And let's face it, nobody really has the appetite to cut fees because they can't afford it, or grow the loan book because they can't afford it. So that is an argument that the sector has been making quite loudly for a considerable time now. You know, let us either increase the fees or give us more money for undergraduate because it doesn't work. It's falling on deaf ears. It's never going to be as important as the NHS, as secondary education, all those other priorities you listed, Nick. If that's not the message that government are going to hear, what should we be asking of our politicians?
Well, I'm sorry to answer how a politician might answer, but I sort of don't accept the premise of your question. For example, you say that the sector has been calling for a long time for fees to go up. They absolutely have not been. They absolutely have not been. You know, they started the national conversation that Jenny is in charge of. Jenny can correct me if I'm wrong. Because up to that point, they had not been calling for fees to be increased, and they started the national conversation because they wanted to look at the full range of alternatives. If the university sector, including all the people in this building, Universities UK Down, had been calling loudly and clearly for a clear inflation-linked fee rise for every year since 2017, when the last fee rise came in, I think we'd be a hell of a lot closer to getting it. Hell of a lot closer. And the one time it's been put before Parliament, which was Joe Johnson did in the summer, he suggested in the House of Lords that fees should go up for institutions with a TEF rating in line with inflation. The Labour front bench and the Lib Dem front bench backed him. So the only time this has recently been discussed in Parliament at a high level, it got support from all 3 parties. So the idea that raising fees is completely out of the question and completely beyond the realms of normal politics is just wrong. People think fees are a vote loser. There's no votes in fees either way. Tony Blair introduced fees, won the next election with a stonking majority. He tripled fees, won the next election with a stonking majority. David Cameron then tripled fees again, won the next election with a stonking majority. Labour introduced fees in Wales, won the next election with a stonking majority. You don't lose votes by around tuition fees. Now, where there are votes, certainly the Labour Party believe there are votes, is in the repayment phase, and Labour have suggested they want to ease the repayment rules, which there are arguments for and there are arguments against. It won't actually affect how much money is coming into your institutions. I actually think the most urgent challenge is around maintenance and cost of living for students, as well as inflation-linked fee rises for institutions. Because, inflation for the last maintenance support for students has gone up by 5% in the last 2 years, and inflation's been, in the teens if you add the 2 years together. And students are finding it harder and harder. For the first time ever, more than half of students now do part-time work during term time, and often dangerous amounts of hours. That's in our data. And so I do think we need to do something around maintenance. The second half of your question was, what does the sector do to convince the politicians of the problems? There are a couple of very, very practical things we can do. First of all, all of the political parties are now getting their candidates in post for the next election. Get those candidates onto your campus. Don't guess who's going to win in your constituency. Get all the mainstream political party candidates onto campus and show them what you do and the importance of what you are to that constituency, and they will name drop you throughout the election campaign. They'll avoid kicking you during the election campaign. They'll become your friends. So get them on campus as soon as they're in post, and explain to them that the core priorities, the number 1, 2, 3 priorities of all our political parties, which are things like economic growth, tackling the skills shortages, climate change, levelling up, none of those, literally not one of those, can be delivered without universities at the heart of them. And I think that's what we need to remind them of the value, which came up a lot this morning in Ken Sloan's brilliant session. But we can't tell politicians that story too often.
Thanks, Nick. So, Jenny, you play a critical role in this. You're UUK's policy lead for funding, and you're chairing the group that has started that national conversation. What are you hearing across the sector? What is already coming through as the things that we should be asking for? How do we think that we should be engaging? What should we be asking for? What are you hearing across the sector from the work that you're doing?
Thanks very much. I think it's interesting when you do this piece of work, because UUK, by definition, is the UK. And one of the things one hears is when you talk about England, Scotland says, whew, if I were so lucky, because they have been taking phenomenal haircuts, both in terms of education and research funding. So the answer is, just to pick up on a couple of things that Nick has said, in terms of the students and the way, the unacceptability or otherwise of increasing the burden to the individual student, actually, a small percentage increase actually won't make that much difference. But the way in which the student loan book has been characterised and the massive, beyond inflation interest rates, there's been so many negative aspects of the implementation of that system. One of the other things we considered was stopping that system. So if we stop the system that's already in place and introduce, for example, a graduate tax, it in fact is very difficult to then, you need a massive injection of funding coming forward. And then what do you do? For this group, the cohorts of students that are graduates that have gone through, who've already got their student loan, are they meant to pay tax a second time? So we've tried to think about alternatives. This is the system that has been designed, but actually changing course and doing something different is actually very, very complicated. I think what there is support for is the way that the loan book has now been reprofiled so that more gets returned to the Treasury. It is so disadvantageous to the lower income earners, and it actually positively advances and advantages those that are going to earn the highest, those that often, and there's a lot of inequality that comes into that, but they in the end will pay off the loans very rapidly and pay much less. And exactly the type of workers that the government also requires, those that go into teaching and those that go into health, the modest earners, are going to end up paying much longer and much more overall. So those types of reprofiling, I think, need to be done.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. And really interesting there. We have talked already quite a lot about domestic undergraduate funding in England, because it does get all the headlines. But you rightly raised the issue around Scotland. So £9,250 in England. The Russell Group's research tells us that it doesn't cover their undergraduate teaching. They cross-subsidise, they run that at a loss. But in Scotland, 9,250 sounds like riches, right? Because actually the government commitment to fee-free education, while laudable, really limits the unit of resource. So only £1,820 for teaching, and once you've got everything coming through the system, it's about £5,000 a student in Scotland. Again, it's never going to have the funding priority. So while it's important, it's always getting squeezed. You've said, it's getting cut. The real terms haircut is 27% in terms of teaching, 31% in terms of research. The model is built on cross-reliance of international student income, innovation income, other forms of income. Is the fee-free approach in Scotland actually sustainable at all, or will we get to a tipping point where actually the government of the day will have to abandon it because it's no longer sustainable without domestic students in Scotland becoming second-class citizens or minority groupings, lower priority than everybody else who's paying more?
I don't think that to the individual students they recognise that we don't have say, oh, your fee's X. No, you can't have a tutorial this week. But, at that level, of course not. I think the bigger narrative that's a concern for the sector is the anxiety that international students are displacing domestic students. Mm-hmm. And we are about to enter a time of an increase. I know education isn't only about 18-year-old school leavers, but that particular cohort is growing and expanding for another decade. And so this call that my child can't get to university because of an international student is going to be one that will be an increasing refrain, whether true or not, because the reality is the university sector, because the numbers we've accommodated by having more places available, but still that narrative exists.
Yeah, absolutely, and we hear it not just around Scotland, but in England, particularly at clearing. Nick, any thoughts on this one from you?
Well, just very, very quickly. I mean, I don't like the Scottish system. Obviously, Scottish voters are entitled to choose whatever system they want, but I don't like it because it limits the number of places. They have student number caps in Scotland, and lots of Scots have to go over the border into England because they can't get in Scotland. So I don't like it, and I wish they would tackle it, but that's obviously an issue for Scotland. But they do benefit from the Barnett consequentials as well. So remember, they do get a little bit of extra funding per head from Westminster. But yeah, I mean the real challenge here is when you underfund universities, they become entrepreneurial, and that's what Scottish universities have done. So Scottish universities have a very high proportion of international students, lots of campuses abroad, etc., etc. And that is the challenge for the sector, because when we go to politicians and we say, oh, we're so hard done by, we've had to take in more international students and set up campuses abroad and act like we're entrepreneurs, the politicians go, brilliant, that's exactly what we want you to do. And when Philip Hammond was Chancellor of the Exchequer, he used to send his officials up to Scotland to find out how Scottish universities could get by on less, because he wanted English universities to get by on less. And that's a real conundrum, I think, for the sector, because we can be pretty entrepreneurial when we want to be, and the more entrepreneurial we are, the harder it is to get the money out of the treasury. So that is an interesting conundrum. Yeah. I'll stop there, but there's lots more I'd like to say.
No, absolutely, but thank you for that. And we've got some delegates from Scottish universities in the room today, so perhaps some comments or questions from them as we go on will be helpful. But I just want to turn to Elena next. You've got experience of leadership roles in both the traditional university sector, public universities, but you've also been chief executive of a new provider. The whole ethos around the new model for technology and engineering, a new model Institute for Technology and Engineering, as we heard from Ken in the keynote this morning, is to challenge convention, to provide the future of engineering education. And government's been very supportive of the idea of new providers coming to the market, marketisation, if you like, more competition, and in fact, might receive some funding to help get established, so about £15 million worth of government funding. That's great, But do you think there are sufficient incentives for new providers to enter the market? Do you think it's a level field? Will you really get the cut through? We saw some great examples this morning of innovation in terms of models, but they're all relatively modest in scale, certainly at the moment, not getting perhaps the traction that government would hope. Is it time to radically rethink how we incentivise innovative models of HE?
Well, I think you asked two questions there.
Yeah, absolutely.
One is there are enough incentives to get new providers, and I think there are laudable incentives. But normally those incentives come from the thinkers, the pedagogists, those people who want to transform higher education, particularly because the tools that we are providing to students perhaps are not up to date to the challenges that we are facing around the world. Those incentives are there, and the people that want to disrupt higher education exist, and that's why they are emerging. But then, if you look at what happens in reality, yes, it might got £50 million revenue, and I was talking to Jenny just before, and Jenny said, but that's peanuts, and it is peanuts when you look at what it actually entails to start a new higher education institution from scratch. You all are people who understand what systems, structures, infrastructure, etc., is required to do that. And the actual CEO of NMIT currently is here as well, and I'll quote him in a moment. But it is a very expensive endeavor. And surprisingly, perhaps, or not, really one of the most costly parts of creating a new institution is the regulatory burden. It is disproportionate for the size of these institutions compared to what is required. And James, he and I, we were talking the other day, and he was saying, listen, we need to learn from the regulation approach to businesses, where not one size fits all, and it is a regulation to the type and size of institution. That makes sense. And I encourage you to ask him that question, because really when we talk about marketizing higher education, we really are not talking about what really happens in the world of business. If we did that, then we would have price competition, and that's the argument that James makes very, very well. There is an appetite for new providers. Otherwise, these new providers like NMIT, TED, LIS wouldn't exist. They exist, they are recruiting students, but more importantly, employers are saying we need these type of disruptors because, and apologies to people from traditional institutions, we are not graduating fit-for-purpose graduates. In fact, what we are doing is graduating, say, for example, engineering graduates, not engineers. Lawyers graduates, but not lawyers. And so that's not what they want. So there are incentives in that sense. But the disincentives of the cost, the burden of regulation are too big. And so we are not going to see many more, I don't think, Joe.
Okay.
And that is really a travesty because we need them. And just a final point on lessons from the challengers. When we talk about entrepreneurialism, flexibility, agility, we should be looking at those models because there is nothing you won't do to satisfy the funders, the stakeholders, when you have a big mission like that. And I think there is a lot to learn from those institutions.
Thank you, Elena. So, making a strong case there for the disruptors and the importance of those. Nick, was I right in you were coming in on that point?
No, I mean, I'm a big fan of diversity of provision, and I agree with everything Elena said.
Fine, no, so I thought I caught your eye there. So one more question from me before I come to the floor. So you've got that last couple of minutes to prepare your first questions. Peter, the spectre of student number controls, we've already heard how bad they are from Nick today. The spectre of student number controls is back in view. Partly because of the perception that some courses are low quality, thanks to poor outcomes, partly because of the size of the student loan book, that other issue that we've talked about quite heavily already, and the burden that is on the public purse. So rather than limiting numbers and potentially curtailing access, what scope do you think there is for a very different model of loan for undergraduate tuition?
Well, thank you, John. My specialist subject. There's plenty of scope. That's the reality, and there are models developing around the world, which I'll talk about in a little bit of detail. We know that the loans that the government issues to the students we call them income contingent. So the repayments are tied to income. So that helps access, because it means that at the point of taking out the loan, the student hasn't got to worry. They've got a fixed obligation to pay a fixed amount of money. If they are unfortunate, their earnings are low, then they have a smaller liability. So that's a very important element of the system that predated the 2012 system, I guess. But that's an important component of things. But it doesn't. Those loans don't have to be issued by the government. They can be issued by the private sector, as in the university. And there's a recent survey of 9 administrators who administer such loans for higher and further education institutions. They estimated there were about 500 higher and further education institutions that had issued income contingent or income share loans, another word for them. This is in the United Kingdom, in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas, and in Africa. So around the world, this phenomenon is developing. Historically, around 30,000 students so far have taken out loans. The industry is growing. The estimate that they all put in was for another 10,000 in 2024, so it's a reasonable rate of growth. And about $350 million worth of loans have been issued so far. So there is a market out there for institutions to issue their own income share loans. And the way that could be used by institutions, because when we talk about is the scope, some of this discussion is the scope for getting the government to do anything? I think no. In the short term, in practice, no. As Ken Sloan was saying, the sector has to act on its own initiative and solve its own problems. And so one of the issues, as Nick mentioned, is maintenance loans, which are clearly inadequate, and it's generally considered that that's leading to an increase in attrition from students who get into financial difficulties. And it's good for the student if they don't get into financial difficulties and they can continue. It's also good for the institution, because the longer they remain paying their tuition fees, that obviously is both good from the reporting point of view, to have a lower rate of attrition, but also financially. And so what a university could do, there's no reason why it itself shouldn't issue income contingent or income share loans to its students to help those who have maintenance problems, and to cover that cost, because obviously initially some money has got to be laid out. There is the anticipation the money will be recovered, but the university would have to lay money out up front. That could come out of bursary funding, so bursaries could be turned into loans. Universities, not all of them I recognise, but many have reserves of their own, investment reserves, some have endowment funds. A portion of that money could be redirected into funding these loans. There are investments like an investment in the gilt market or the equity market, an investment that I think has a better social good and is an investment that the university has some influence over. So those are some possibilities. In terms of the tuition fee cap, which is clearly a material problem, and there's no indication it's going to continue and get a worse problem as we go forward if it remains frozen. There are all sorts of other techniques that could be used, and possibly just an idea. A university could design a 3-year course that combined a 2-year BA and a 1-year MA. And then, because one of the ironies of all this is that postgraduate education is a free market. There's no fee cap for domestic students. So if you put together a 2-year BA and a 1-year MA, the whole 3-year package would have an unregulated fee. Now, obviously, the student wouldn't necessarily get enough from the state to pay the whole cost, but that's where the university could come in and fund that difference with an income share loan. And then most radically of all, there's no reason why on the face of it, why universities shouldn't convert from fee cap status to straight approved status. And the minute it's approved status, it has no fee cap. So this fee cap only exists in the fee cap. They're explicitly called fee cap institutions. And if you go to approved status, there's no limit on the fees that can be charged. The loan the student gets is only $6,150 per annum. But again, the university can fill up the gap between what they'll get from the state and what the fees are with its own income share loan. And a nice thing about this is it shows the issues that post-2012 became this perception that the student was a consumer, whereas I think a better representation of the relationship between a university and the student is as partners. They're partners in exercise to impart knowledge. And with this financial arrangement, it mimics that partnership, and they both then have a stake in the future of the student. So I think there is scope, but relies on the sector taking its own way forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So quite different to where we're at the moment, but that sense of partnership and shared ownership, shared risk in the future. So just some nods around the table. Elena, you wanted to come in on that point?
No, I'm just agreeing.
Great, okay. Some very different thinking and a radical academic model thrown in for good measure there. The 2+1 integrated master's approach, so you can move to an unregulated fee. So quite progressive thinking there. I hope that has piqued your interest in on the floor. Have we got any questions from you good people for our panel? Straight up at the back, go on. Durfel.
Thank you. A lot of the discussion has been based on an assumption that we deserve to be well funded. What are we doing to prove value for money?
Great question, and one that very much echoes Ken's opening address this morning. Anybody want to take that one?
Well, I guess if the university is lending some of the money to the student, then it is sharing that risk. And so if it doesn't deliver value for money, it'll get paid less. So you haven't got to worry because there's no fixed fee anymore. There's now a variable fee tied to outcomes.
Indeed. Jenny.
How do you define value for money? I mean, that's a typical narrative as well around poor quality or low quality courses, in that the only measure, easy, is the employment at 15 months, whereas in fact there is I would, and perhaps many people in this room, but not everybody, might think there's an innate value in being educated in the first place and the process of going to university. But I don't think we're absolved of the responsibility to do things in the most economic way that we can, not to be profligate with spend. I mean, I don't think, and we all know the distaste not only the public felt, but the sector felt when there was rash abandon amongst some vice-chancellors, that often comes up, doesn't it? And their packages, for example. So I think it's a fair question. I think that the tools for measurement, or it's trying to get a very blunt instrument for what is a paragraph or a page or two of conversation.
Nick.
Yeah, I mean, I accept Jenny's criticisms of thinking through the value for money lens. And of course, Peter was thinking a bit through the value for money lens when he was talking about graduates who don't necessarily pay back all their borrowings, etc. But I'm afraid we just have to look through that lens, because it doesn't matter who's in government. We are battling for public resources against every other area of public funding, and it's completely reasonable for the Chief Secretary to the Treasury to say to the Education Secretary of State, why should I give you more money relative to every other demand for taxpayers' money? So I'm afraid I think we do have to think a bit through the value for money lens, even though we clearly want to broaden it out. In direct answer to your question, what are we doing to deserve it? Well, and this is why I was saying get those candidates on your campuses to tell them, because I think we have such a good story to tell. 97% of mothers of young kids want their kids to go to university, so we're meeting families' aspiration levels. We're delivering levelling up. Universities are often the biggest employer in their local area. We're running hospitals. Also, you know the list is better than I do, and in fact, some of it's been up on the screen behind us earlier in the day. But I do think we could go a bit further, and I know this will be deeply unpopular among anybody who's a member of the USS, for example, but universities are charities, and the idea that we are paying about 25% of salary into a very old-fashioned pension scheme, while at the same time pleading poverty to government, is very strange. You know, there's no other bit of the charity sector that has pensions like the USS anymore. It's public sector does, private sector don't, charities don't. And I do think we need to show willing to make reforms. And it's a tragedy. It's an absolute tragedy that we've rolled over. I know the legal reasons for doing it. I know the USS is now suddenly very well funded because of the way they've done their investments. It's an absolute tragedy now that we've given back, although that whole argument is now dead. We need to show that we understand the value for money priorities of whoever's in government and meet them halfway, I think.
Yeah, the USS pensions reform being a missed opportunity. But it was interesting as you were talking there were quite a lot of nodding heads in the room about the situation we're in at the moment around USS and how that fails to resonate with the pleading poverty comment there. Any more comments from the panel on that issue? Elena?
Just perhaps through the lens of international students, momentarily, if I may. I don't know whether you know why people like me come to this country in the first place, or why do we choose to pay huge amounts, exorbitant amounts of money to come here, and then some of us to stay and contribute to the economy, and so on and so forth. And it is because of the reputation that the UK has had around the world, historically, and hopefully forevermore, about placing high-quality education at the center of its society, and about that sort of inclusion of diverse ideas that then turn into diverse solutions, diverse innovations that are shared around the world. So I just wanted to remind us that that's the kind of thing that people around the world have thought through history about the UK. But of course, we have to question ourselves, is value for money now something that people around the world will be thinking about when there is a rhetoric about not wanting international students' fee caps, etc., and equally then the demand for the income to come?
No, indeed, a really interesting dilemma, not least because higher education is the 5th largest export sector in the UK. So, you know, it is really, really important, certainly as a soft power driver, if not in terms of pounds, shillings and pence. Nick?
No, I agree with everything Eleanor says. Again, I mean, yeah, she's absolutely right. And
I'm just not reading your body language.
Everything you said, I was just impressed by what I was hearing.
Fantastic. Any more questions at this point from the floor? Oh, there's a couple. Steve.
Thank you. Just a question, I think. Is there any thoughts or opportunities in the future for organisations to merge as a response to the funding challenge, and if it's not going to change anytime soon?
Really interesting question. I'm going to throw this at Jenny.
Well, I think that mergers just simply to save costs are not the right solution. I think that we are academic institutes and there must be a driving narrative. So I'm very happy to syndicate backroom functions. So you could imagine a situation where you could do that, which you wouldn't need to merge. And if you think about school academies, for example, that's some of the things that they have done. So I think that merger is a very interesting prospect. In the short term, it doesn't save you any money. In the short term, you're paying far more to, as I am well aware at the moment, very expensive lawyers and accountants to do massive processes of due diligence. Everybody's ringing you up thinking their services are absolutely what you need at this moment. And so actually, I think that for those universities that are on the precipice and about to fall off a cliff, they won't have the money to do that type of work. There may be the need for those individual institutions to have some transformation funding. So I think that merger just to save costs, I think there's other ways of achieving those efficiencies, but I still think that as an idea to propel what universities can do, I think that the merger that I've embarked upon will give me a much broader palette to operate and contribute to the academic mission from. It isn't purely about cost saving. I think there's other methods that you could use if that's your only goal.
Let me just ask a slightly related question. So you wouldn't advocate merger for cost-saving reasons primarily. However, if universities are in dire financial trouble, should the government actually allow them to fail? So we've had the rhetoric around it will allow financially unstable institutions to fail. But when it comes to public universities, there haven't been any examples as yet. Do you think they will actually advise them to fail? Should they allow them to fail? Or do you think that actually enforcing merger so that they are effectively having the power taken away from them without being dissolved completely, is that a path that the government should choose in preference to allowing them to fail?
I think that there's two things I'd like to say. First of all, when you're very junior, as your career develops, you sort of imagine there's loads of people in those rooms that know all the answers and they've got the plan and and I think as we're in the COVID inquiry, there were never a more apposite time to mention. They're just bumbling along, making it up as they go along, just like everybody else. So the idea that there is some master plan around failing or otherwise of universities, I think, it'll happen sort of almost just because it's happened rather than by design. And I think that the other comment that I will make, I was going to say that in part I agree with you, Nick. Yeah, get your local MP onto the campus and show them how great you are. When they're with their constituents, they'll praise you from the rooftops. They'll go into Parliament and they'll take a very different strategic view on the universities. And it's exactly the same as happens. My background is medical, I'm a doctor. Everybody knew that rationalising services and transferring them into centres of expertise, it was all great in theory until it was my hospital next door and my MP's constituency that was going to use that hospital. And then there is that dichotomy of they want the local provision. So I don't think there's a grand master plan. It will be a very interesting spectre to see what happens. And of course, as many of the people in this room know, we've all had to write our insurance policies for what actually happens in the event that some catastrophe occurs, and what are student protection plans. It'd be interesting to see how they are enacted.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to go to the question at the back. Rhiannon?
Thank you. So this question's developed as you've been talking, because Nick started with the Robbins principle. So thank you. Nice to hear Robbins coming into any conversation. And I was sitting here thinking, well, all right, so maybe Robbins is broken. Maybe actually not everybody who has the ability can go to university anymore. And then I was thinking, well, actually, if students don't really have to pay fees, let's not get into that conversation, but if the fees aren't the problem, then maybe it's the maintenance loans. And then we talked about maintenance loans. I thought, well, actually, do you know the one thing we haven't covered is where's the place of apprenticeships? Because for universities, apprenticeships are a bit of a challenge because you are paid less to deliver an apprenticeship, but they do sort out the maintenance bit for the students. So ignoring the fact that this has nothing to do with the international students or it has nothing to do with how you balance between teaching and research funding, what do you think the future place is of apprenticeships, given that that's something that employers are keen on, that students are keen on, that politicians are keen on, but actually universities are less keen and as a result fewer are being offered?
Anybody want to take that, Nick?
Yeah, I don't mind having a go, and thank you for... I didn't use the words Robin principle, but it absolutely was echoing around my head, because, of course, October 2023 was the 60th anniversary of the Robbins principle, and we've done lots about that on our website if you're interested in knowing more, and I think it should continue to be the drive. There's no other bit of the education system where we just say, sorry, we're full, you can't come in. And it's crazy to do that in higher education, in my view. So I'm glad you've come to a similar conclusion, and also on maintenance. So on apprenticeships, I personally think apprenticeships are a bit of a red herring. I mean, yes, they're fantastic. Yes, they work when they... I've got a very close family member who's recently started a degree apprenticeship, and it's working out very well. But you've got to know exactly what profession you're going to go into, and be confident that profession's still going to be here in 10, 20, 30 years' time. You've got to find an apprenticeship, and they're very hard to get onto, good ones, because the supply is much, much lower than ministers pretend. The policies are not in place to deliver them. Every time Rob Halfon says, I want half of all undergraduates to be on degree apprenticeships, I think, well, where are the government policies to deliver that? Because the university vice-chancellors I talk to, some of them are thinking of pulling out of apprenticeships, not expanding the numbers. Dyson, you may have seen only this week, Dyson's just done exactly that, and they're not going to run their courses as apprenticeships anymore. And also, if you look at the socioeconomic breakdown of people who do apprenticeships, it's nothing like as diverse as the people who do undergraduate. So I think apprenticeships are great when they work. I mean, there are radical things you could do to increase the number. There was a report recently that said you should move the student loan system that we've been talking about today to cover apprenticeships too, so that the cost of the system was much lower because the money would get repaid eventually, and that would unlock some demand. But you'd still hear complaints from vice-chancellors about Ofsted coming in and treating universities as if they're just big school. You'd still hear complaints about employers saying, I'm struggling to survive. My company might not be here in 2 years' time. I can't have a big 10 new apprentices start this year because I'm just struggling to survive over all the crises we've been living through. So, look, apprenticeships are wonderful when they work, but they're not the answer to 500,000 young people who want access to higher education every year, in my view.
Absolutely. Okay, another question in the middle there.
Yeah, hello, I'm Tim Emmett from St Mary's University in Twickenham. I want to ask Peter directly, I think, because you were touching on some really interesting things that I think worthy of greater amplification to this group. You said that you could launch a 2-year BA and a 1-year MA and move to an unregulated fee structure. Would that 2-year BA fall under the current student loan system? Could you explain a bit more about how that might work?
Yes, I can't remember the numbers exactly. For a 2-year, if it's a 3-year, if you're in the approved state, well, no, do you know how much?
You could borrow a bit more. If you're on a 2-year course,
You're on a 2-year, it's
2-year accelerated
degree.
degree.
For a whole 227.
It's something like you can certainly borrow more if you're
you can borrow substantially more. So I can't remember the exact number, but yes, it comes under the student loan scheme, and it's more than 9,250. So I think it should be the whole amount.
It's the way that it might work with accelerated degrees. James, you want to explain?
10,800 per year for an accelerated.
Right, sorry, for those that couldn't hear, 10,800 per year on that accelerated scheme, thanks to James Newby from Enmite. Sorry, I was just acknowledging who shared the actual number. Sorry, Peter, do you want to continue?
No. I mean, that's the answer, isn't it, Tim? So it is under the student loan scheme, but the amount is different.
So we've got a price for the first 2 years of 10.8 per year, and then you've got an unregulated third year on that master's programme.
Which you can borrow elsewhere.
From the university?
From the university.
Right, yeah, absolutely. Shared risk.
It's going to be on an income share basis. It would have to be the university who provided it.
Yeah, and Buckingham, that I'm on the board of, does exactly this. Most of their degrees are 2 years, but their price is higher than 10.8, and you have to cover the gap either by private borrowing or parental support or bursaries or whatever.
Indeed. So I guess it's down to the sector. Will you take on that risk? Do you back yourselves to make sure that your graduates earn sufficient to be able to pay back that risk? That's the big conundrum that Peter is suggesting. Any more questions at this point in the room?
I can ask one. Thank you. Is the sector as a whole, or are individual institutions more important in the overall piece? And if it's overall institutions, can a market function in this space?
Yeah. Have we got anyone wanting to take this one on? We've got someone hiding their head in their hands and somebody else not understanding the question. So, Peter.
Well, yes. There's a lot of talk about the sector being subject to marketisation, but one of the key principles in a market is, I think Elena was alluding to, is the freedom to set price. It's the most basic element of a free market, that you have different products and different provision and different prices. So we do have that, of course, in relation to international students and postgraduate. It's only the undergraduates that we don't have that for. So ideally, I think the government would liberalise undergraduate fees, but that doesn't look likely in the near future. So I'm suggesting ways to perhaps try to get around the political problem while enabling the universities to secure additional funding.
I think it's a great question. I was thinking, it reminds me of Margaret Thatcher's quote that there's no such thing as society, which everybody knows, but then after that she said there's no such thing as society, there's only individuals striving to do good or something. And I'm not sure we have a sector, really. We have such diversity with so many different types of institutions. We have a system, I think. You know, are FE colleges delivering HE? Are they really part of the same sector as Oxford and Cambridge? I'm not sure. I think we have a system and people are fulfilling different roles within that system. And I'm not sure we have a single sector as such. And again, Robin's talked about a system. It's a really interesting question.
Indeed. Any more questions from the floor? There's one at the back there. Jeff.
I could probably just shout out. I've not heard anybody mention LLE in the lifelong loan entitlement. Yes. And I was just wondering whether anyone on the panel saw it as the lifesaver.
Yeah, so I'll rephrase that. Is it the lifesaver, or is it just restructuring the same old loan system? Jenny.
I doubt it is the lifesaver, is my summary. Of course, it is the way in which all funding will move. So we're given to understand. I just can't see that it's also going to have it within itself quite a cost in terms of, can we just think for a moment? So if you can do a potpourri of qualifications, which I'm not unsympathetic to that as somebody who finds loads of things interesting and might want to do a bit of this, bit of that. But how are these then come consolidated into an award? Who holds the ring on that award? Who organises the communication between the individual bodies? And then over what period of time do they become relevant? So I try and be open-minded and optimistic rather than the computer, not in mind. But I can see a lot of practical and costs associated with it at this moment in time.
Yeah, okay. Very, very interesting. Any more questions? Not
Can I just say,
please, Peter.
As Jenny says, it's going to be a very bureaucratic system, in the same way the apprenticeship levy is fantastically bureaucratic. And that was the reason that Dyson gave for dropping the apprenticeship related product. And there's absolutely no reason why universities shouldn't self-fund lifelong courses, and then they can tailor them to particular needs, rather than everybody being allowed 20,000, 30,000, whatever loans, which are loans. They're not free in any case. They're loans. You've got to pay them back. The universities could look at individuals, and there are some people who, at a particular point in life, it's absolutely worth investing. It might be mature, but it's still worth investing in their education. And the university could offer, once you're outside home undergraduates, the university can fund it through an income share agreement, and then receive the remuneration after the person has benefited from the education. So I would suggest there the sector could do a much better job itself than relying on a very bureaucratic system.
Indeed.
I think we're making a mistake here, if I may say so. I think there are challenges making the LLE a success. The minute the Treasury gets their hands on it, the number of courses that will be eligible will be tight. But look, ministers regard this as their key policy. Michelle Donnellan compared it to the founding of the NHS when she launched it, which is obviously overblown. But if we are too clever by half, which we have a tendency to do in our sector, and give the government 100 reasons why the LLE is a bad idea, they will just cancel it. Much better, and I read a piece on Wonky this week on making this argument, saying it's got all these problems, let's just delay it. For God's sake, it doesn't come in fully till after the next election anyway, and it was announced in 2020. We're going to have had 5 years getting ready for this thing by the time it comes in anyway. Much better to play ball with it, get it in, and then hopefully gradually expand it and improve it once it's in. If we forever complain about it, it won't happen. And actually, as a country, lifelong learning is really something that could be incredibly valuable. We're all living longer. People need to reskill. Industries are changing. So although it's flawed, let's work with the government, get it in place, and constantly improve it would be my advice. Not if we emit only negative rhetoric about the LLE, it will not happen, and we will have ourselves to blame for that, I think.
You heard it here first. So we haven't talked yet about research funding. It's a precarious business, and research careers are inherently precarious. Should we be doing something to change the research funding application system so that the deck is less favoured towards the haves rather than the have-nots? Is there something essentially broken there that is stopping institutions from embracing research because of that lack of financial certainty? Elena.
Well, I mean, Nick will know this better, but 25% of research is already covered by other funding in universities. If universities are under pressure financially, you can just stop really recruiting home students and stop doing research, and then you'll be better off. But of course, I'm being facetious there. Come on, wake up. It's a last session. But of course, the actual mission of institutions is to educate, is to produce knowledge that help people. So we will have to rely on international institutions. Sorry to bang on that, but really, that's the truth. So if we are going to do that, we really need to understand that international recruitment and tuition fees are actually not an even field either. They normally, international students rely on rankings a lot, and those are, of course, biased to older institutions with longer histories. So I think we do have to think about how to fund research in a different way. I am of the view that we need to work more closely with companies and with the private sector to fund research. Not that it's done, it's been done forever, but I believe that we have to be looking at other sources of funding and stop cross-subsidizing. That'll be my message from today, as you can see.
Absolutely. But in terms of the international student piece that you mentioned there, it just reminded me of the point that was made earlier. Aspiration among the UK families to go to university is really, really high. 97%, I think you said, Nick. But they always want somebody else to pay for it. And actually, the reality you're talking about is that international student income not only helps to cross-subsidise UK students, but a significant proportion of our research endeavours as well. Finding a solution to research funding is going to be really, really critical if we're going to be a world power in research, or continue to be a world power in research. Jenny.
I think doing research is a fundamental identity that comes with universities and distinguishes us from other parts. And I think from the government's perspective, you might think, well, why only just fund one or two institutes to do that? But that makes the assumption that only the good quality stuff comes out of them, and that is absolutely not the case. I also think that it's important to motivate and retain the good quality staff, that ability to have a variety of interests. But the other thing that I think we must also recognise is, in general, perhaps with vaccines, people realised that research did have a purpose and an output, but it's not unreasonable for us to think, how our research does translate into changing people's lives or adding to the world and benefiting it. And so I, in fact, am quite swayed by some of the, I think if you look at a university, one of the first things I do is look to their ref submission and what did they produce in terms of those impact cases. And I don't think that's an unreasonable bargain, that we need to make the case for continuing to do research, and it's something I think this country should be very proud of. But I also think that we have got to think how that is adding, not all of it, but at least some of it, to translation, to benefit, to impact. And that is the justification for wanting more money for it.
Thank you. We've run out of time for questions, unfortunately, but I would like to turn to our panel for just their final comments, final statements before we close the session. Nick, do you want to kick us off?
I'll say three very, very, very quick things. On the research thing, I'm actually quite optimistic because all political parties, and particularly George Freeman, the current science minister, are very much in favour of expansion of GDP, a proportion of GDP spent on research. We're about 1.7, 1.8%. He wants it to be 3.5%. And if we were ever to get anywhere near those sorts of numbers, like some other countries do, then actually you can have more in the Golden Triangle and more in the rest of the country, and it's win-win. But we will see. My other 2 points are, thanks again for inviting me. We recently did a report, I haven't mentioned, with sums on the terms and conditions of academic staff, and Emma Ogden, who did the work on that's in the room somewhere. And it shows very interesting, and I do draw your attention to it, because it showed that the terms and conditions of academics are so fantastic that it explains why we've got the precarity problem. And I think as a sector, we need to wise up to that. Actually, if we're going to protect the USS forever, etc., we're going to go on having a precarity problem among early career researchers. And the third thing I want to say is we published a report today, which is highly relevant to this audience, called Change by Design, How Universities Should Design Change Initiatives for Success, by a guy called Paul Woodgate, who was a consultant in the HE sector for 30 years. And it's his distilled 30 years knowledge of how you deliver change in university that works and how you avoid change that doesn't work, and it's freely available on our website. And I've got to tell you, we've had the busiest day on our website for ages, so there's a lot of interest in this report. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Nick. Jenny?
Briefly to say that it is a wicked problem, thinking about the long-term funding conundrum, but we need to sort it out. And I think that overall, I'd like to say we should be incredibly proud of the university sector. And I know that we often get slightly downbeaten, but overall, we're so privileged to be part of this ecosystem in this country. And we mustn't forget all those brilliant aspects. And all of us have a common interest in remaining world leaders in higher education and to be key attractors, not only for economic benefit, but that soft power that we exert throughout the world because of our status as one of the best educators on the planet.
Hear, hear. Elena?
I read recently something from Nicholas Barr, and he was making a point about separating higher education strategy and policy from short-term politics. And I think that's something that we really need to push for, because otherwise it'll be very complicated. It is not appropriate to have to change constantly due to the politics of the country. But to end on a more positive note, and I've talked a lot about the rest of the world, I don't think that UK has lost its appeal yet. And I really believe that wholeheartedly. I travel a lot, I talk to people from around the world, and I agree with Jenny. We have something really special here, as long as we remember that we are part of the world, not the center of it.
Absolutely. And finally, Peter.
Well, I don't want to end up on the negative note, but we have to accept the government's run out of money. If we look at the way the gilt market is behaving, we have a severe financial crisis in this country. And I don't think it's a question of the politicians have fallen out of love with the sector. I think they recognise the huge value of the sector to the country. I just think they don't have the money. And so the issue is we have to do it ourselves, which hopefully, on a positive note, we'll all take that as an opportunity.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, when I do these things, when I chair panels of this nature, the last thing I want is people sitting mute. I think we've had 4 absolutely fantastic panelists today who have been really, really interesting, thought-provoking in their comments. Please join me in giving them a very, very warm round of applause.
Train to Carmarthen in the lane.
No, I didn't drive. I think you're free to go if you'd like, or you can stay on here. Thank you so much to our panelists. Another round of applause for them, please. And Joel. Okay, so not long now until the wine, I promise, but so just stick with me because we've got some very important people to thank who made today possible. I don't have a clicker, so I don't know if we could go to the next slide. So we all know that it takes a network of trusted service providers to help universities run effectively, and would like to thank all of our exhibitors for being an integral part of this conference. They each provide essential services, solutions, and ideas to help educational institutions thrive and evolve into the future. In a few minutes, our conference sponsors Time Edit will be hosting a drinks reception in the main foyer, which gives you another chance to engage with your peers, the conference exhibitors, and members of the SUMS team. We thank Time Edit for their generous support in hosting these drinks, and we welcome their commercial director, Matt Dalton, to the stage to briefly share some information about the work Time Edit is already doing in the sector and how they can help you. So, Matt.
Thank you. I don't have a clicker either, and I've got 2 slides. Thank you. Super. Okay. Now, it says I've got 5 minutes, but I'm going to keep it very short. A, there's trains, and B, there's alcohol. So, very briefly, in order, there's 3 things I want to say today. So, firstly, a massive thank you to the SUMS team. It's been great, and I guess, as I said, there's beer and wine just as we come in. The second thing is we are a Swedish-based company. And we have Swedish chocolates. We've been trying to give them away in earnest downstairs. But we have some colleagues at the back with some bags. If you want to take away a tote bag, there are some chocolates in there. I'm trying to do an order of priority, really. And then finally, a little bit about what we do and who we are. So some of you may have seen this on the tables downstairs. But essentially what we do is curriculum management, scheduling, workforce management, and also kind of student evaluation at the end. So it's a platform that has all these different modules on it. I'm not going to wax lyrical, make you bored to tears, but what I just want to say is essentially I'm very, very aware of the disconnectivity within institutions and the data that exists, but often isn't connected. So what we actually provide to institutions is that ability to connect the dots. So right at the beginning on the left-hand side, you have kind of designing a curriculum, managing it, validating it, through to workforce management, through to scheduling, through to publishing, and then finally at the end you've got your evaluation and also the reporting tool. And that sits on the same database. So we work with around 200, I think, well, it's 204 institutions globally. Within the UK, our journey is relatively new, so there's 10, but the aim is to kind of double that in the next year or 2. So as I said, I want to keep it brief and short, but it'd be great to maybe have a conversation with you outside. I know I've already spoken to a number of you today who I'm either already engaging with, so it's great to put a face to a name. Or if you want to have a conversation straight away, there's myself, there's Leanne. I'd ask her to stand, but I think she is standing. And then Maria, who's come over from Gothenburg as well last night, so she's here as well on the right-hand side. So as I said, some chocolates, there's some alcohol outside, a little bit about what we do, but I always find these things a bit awkward to sell my wares, but it's there, we're here, I'd love to have a chat with you outside, so thank you.
I'll also make it brief. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bernard Hyde, the Chief Executive of the SUMS Group. I just want to wrap up very briefly today's wonderful conference. I sincerely hope that each of you takes away with you some degree of optimism about the utopian futures we've been talking about, the opportunities, and go away not stressing too much on the daunting dystopian challenges facing the sector at the moment. Conferences like this give us a chance to take a step back, or forward in this case, and for us to reflect on the point of our organisations. What are we here for, as we've discussed and explored earlier in the day? So like all things, university missions and the wider landscape will evolve. It's going to continue to evolve. And it's vitally important that we take stock and really understand the wider landscape, not just what's happening within the sector, or rather than a sector, those connecting circles, interest groups that make up the sector, and be planning, see how the wider landscape is responding and planning ahead for the future. So at SUMS, we're here with you as a proud partner. We've worked with universities of all shapes and sizes for over 50 years. We are of the sector and for the sector, and we're uniquely positioned to provide support as an objective insider across a wide range of areas, across all professional services and into the academic support areas. We're here to listen, so please do let us know if and where you need extra specialist support, or where you think we should be developing our services further to support you. So one last thank you goes to each of you for coming and making this our best attended SUMS conference to date. We value each of you as a member of our community. SUMS exists as a membership organisation which is unique in sort of consultancy world. We really do see you as partners in our mission to help improve the effectiveness and efficiency of universities. A critical part of that for us is the sharing of good practice, and hopefully, like today's events, helps facilitate that. And we'd ask you, with that in mind, please do share the insights and what you've learned today with colleagues so that that learning can spread as far as possible. So I'm just going to end on a couple of practical notes, which I've been given a list. Hand back your name badges, please, and lanyards at the reception desk. They'll be recycled. Please complete the conference survey, which is on our app. Someone's put in, and I'm very loath to mention this in this digital age, for those that prefer sharing written feedback, we have a small number of printed surveys available at the reception desk for you to complete. But please use the app. And finally, I'm really pleased to announce that we'll be holding the SUMS annual conference virtually a year today on the 14th of November here in Woburn House. So hopefully we'll see many of you back then. So with that, please do stay on for the drinks reception if you can. Otherwise, I'd like to wish you all safe travels back if you're not going to Carnarvon. And I look forward to seeing you all next year. Thank you.